Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to deal with the final moments, the last day's testimony in the preliminary hearing of Barry Morphew. It was day 4, which is the final day. On this final day, it also came to light that Barry had told investigators that he, quote, accidentally clipped Suzanne Morphew's nose with his hand. Now, going into court is really a battle between storytellers and storytelling. It's not just any story. Your story has got to be anchored in evidence as a lawyer, and it must highlight the most salient and legally actionable aspects from thousands of pages of statements and discovery. A good prosecutor ends with a bang. They want to finish off with a powerful flourish. But the same applies to the defense. They will want to find their best evidence to support a counter-narrative and to try to make heads spin. So the question is, do you think the respective counsel succeeded? Well, who succeeded more? Before we get to day 4, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So at some point yesterday, Ashley Franco from KKTV tweeted, "Lots of tension in the room between prosecutors and defense right now." And that was really all about this whole idea of both of the respective counsels sort of going in for the kill, both of them wanting to end on a high note in terms of their own case, right? And the one ending on a high note ends up being a low note for the other, and so that is why there was that tension, because they're both trying to end their story on a very compelling note, right? So in terms of the prosecution concluded their case by raising a possible DV side to Barry. In the John Benet Ramsey case, there's also this notion of Burke accidentally clobbering his sister in the face with a golf club that actually required stitches. And although the date of that's not clear, I believe it actually happened on John Benet's birthday. We do know that it happened around August. Quite a lot rests on whether something like that is accidental or deliberate. You know, did Burke do that deliberately or accidentally? Well, a lot depends on the answer to that. What we do know, speaking generally, is that Barry is emotional, quick to anger, seemed insecure about Suzanne during their marriage, was financially insecure, and I think his wife wanting to leave him, he seemed to want to prevent that. Also, he's a hunter who seems to take pleasure in skinning and killing animals. It may seem normal to hunt chipmunks in your free time, but ending 85 critters seems, at least to me, a bit much. Now, in the previous video that I put up, I spoke a little bit about present bias and delaying gratification. In a situation like this, where you have a family suffering from marital discord and distress and conflict, there's what is required is going through the pain of separation. And some people don't want to go through that pain. Some people don't want... People want to get back to their fairy tale, get back to the good life as soon as possible. And that can lead to poor decision making. Did that happen in this case? Perhaps the counter argument is that Barry was just an intense guy. So if you want to make the argument that Barry was also someone who couldn't really think about the long-term consequences, if you think about it, he's emotional, he's quick to anger, he seems to have a temper, right? On the other hand, he was quite disciplined in terms of his social media. He didn't give a lot of interviews. He appeared on Facebook under a controlled scenario. But how were his emotions in terms of Suzanne? How were his emotions in terms of the fabric of this case? Because, you know, one thing that is clear is that the inability to delay gratification is the reason why a lot of crimes happen, because people want a shortcut to an easy solution, and they think they're not going to be consequences, and of course the consequences are grave, often permanent, and often lifelong. And I know we as the true crime community often look from the outside in to these cases and say, wow, was it worth it? How did you think you were going to get away with it? Well, they're not in that place of thinking about the consequences. They're thinking about the short-term benefit. Nevertheless, if you are the defense and it's your job to defend Barry, perhaps your counter-argument is going to be that, look, Barry was just an intense guy and he enjoyed nature and the outdoors, and he was a hunter just like a lot of hunters. That doesn't make him a criminal. Well, except your average hunter doesn't have his wife go missing. So is that just random? Is that just a coincidence? I do think the prosecution chose a strong note to end off on. Was it the best note? That's the question. But the fact is that the defense was so upset about this, that this was even raised, probably shows they scored a few legal points. What do you guys think? Once again, I'm quoting from Ashley Franco's Twitter feed. She said that the prosecution asked Agent Grusing about the domestic situation, and his response was that Barry told investigators there was a time when he accidentally clipped Suzanne Morphew's nose with his hand, right? Now, we definitely want more information about that. When did it happen? What were the circumstances around that? What exactly was the nature of that injury? Was there just a slight bruise to her nose, or was it worse than that? Did she need medical treatment? Did anyone else see that? So it should be noted that when the prosecution brought up this possibility of a domestic situation, the defense objected to this. And then the judge said, look, we need to move things along because he's getting objections to every third question. What that shows is that the defense were obviously antagonized, but because this is something that could, if it's material, if it's substantial, if it is substantiated, if it's justified, it's definitely going to raise questions. So the prosecution, in their sort of final salvo, also asked Agent Grusing if Barry Morphew had told them he was following Suzanne Morphew's phone. I'm not quite sure what that means, following. Does it mean keeping track of? Does it mean spying on it? What does it mean to be following her phone? Anyway, he told investigators Suzanne gave him her phone in Mexico to show him who he was talking to. And I guess that should be who she was talking to. But often you see something like that where you asked about, were you spying on your wife's phone? And then when there's an admission, it tends to be kind of harmless. Oh, yes, when you're in Mexico, something. Well, if that happened in the past, why wouldn't it have happened during this period of increased conflict when, after Suzanne had told him, I'm done? If it had happened in the past, why wouldn't there be a temptation, a need, a desire to find out what was really going on? And irrespective of whether Barry did get hold of her handset, I'm sure that he wanted to. The question is, did he succeed? When did he succeed? What did he see, if he did? And personally, I think that he did. I've said that previously, that I think that he was aware of what was going on, and it was heartbreaking, infuriating and frustrating to him, amongst other things. It gave him the sense of urgency, the sense of desperation. But the other side of the story is the fact that there's no body nor any human remains. It's not a foregone conclusion that the judge will rule for the trial to go ahead. But having said that, Judge Patrick Murphy did take 25 pages of notes. That's around 1 page for every hour of testimony over a period of 4 days. That's a lot of notes. The defense have said they don't think the state have met the burden of proof, but they would say that, wouldn't they? One of the best moments for the defense on the fourth and final day was this, a potentially crucial blunder by the cops on arguably the most vital piece of evidence. And this is a tweet from Lauren Scharf. Quote, "It was the cap for the tranquilizer needle sheath inside the dryer. Another deputy then took photos. Nielsen asked Deputy Himshoot, what was that clunking noise? Himshoot said, I picked up the item and then put it back down. He didn't file that in his report." End quote. Now, all of this is sort of angling towards contamination, angling towards a botched investigation, angling towards police clumsiness, angling towards how long it took for the police to find this, and perhaps even this idea of planting evidence, because the fact is that this deputy picked up the item. He said so. He picked up the item and put it back. And so how long a shot is it but from that, I picked up the item and put it back, to someone putting it there in the first place? Also, he doesn't file that in his report. All of this is creating a certain amount of doubt in the mind of the jury or the judge or anyone considering this information. So what you heard there was a cap of a magic marker, which is fairly heavy. It's a fairly big one. I'm going to play the sound of a cap of a smaller magic marker falling on a wooden table. And now an even smaller cap. So I think Barry Morphew's defense are no slouches. They are very astute. They pay excellent attention to detail. And so just hearing the sound in terms of this is pretty significant. You can clearly hear from when I've dropped these plastic caps, you can clearly hear what it is and what it sounds like it is. It was actually from a larger cap to a smaller cap, but you can, if you didn't know what it was, you could probably guess that it's something dropping on the ground, right? And so that is exactly what happened in that case, but with this crucial piece of evidence. Not only is it picked up, it's dropped. So going back to Lauren's tweet, she also tweeted, quote, Deputy Himshoot also was talking in the garage about the dart gun and how it didn't function and didn't seem to have been fired in a very long time. So finding the tranquilizer needle sheath cap in the dryer was odd, end quote. Do you notice they're now referring to it as tranquilizer needle sheath cap? But, I mean, we basically are going to be calling it the dart cap, right? Tranquilizer dart cap. Otherwise, it's just really a mouthful. But the point that is being made here, I think, by the defense is that because of the contamination and could perhaps have been planted, although I'm not sure if they've said as much, and the fact that this gun doesn't work, it needs to be excluded. But could there not be another tranquilizer gun that hasn't been found? Another possibility that I've seen in the comments is that, would you really need to use the gun, the firing weapon? Couldn't one just use the agent? Couldn't one just use the dart or the needle? And I tend to think one could. So again, speaking in general, simply judging from the copious note-taking of the judge, I don't think the volume of the evidence is lacking. There's certainly a lot of evidence in this case. I've certainly been surprised by how much evidence there is. The question is whether the quality of the evidence is sufficient to take you in one direction or another. Going back to Lauren's tweet, she said, according to the forensic scientist report, there was an unknown male DNA on the seat of Suzanne Morphew's bike. Aiton, that's the defense counsel, asked if Agent Cale knew if there were individuals that had matches to the DNA, if he would have had a swab sample done. Apparently he said yes. To be honest, I don't think it was a surprise when Judge Patrick Murphy said he wasn't going to make a decision that day. He'd taken 25 pages of notes. It was 4 days. So he was going to apply his mind, and in my opinion, he is going to have the case go to trial. I think there are some doubts, but I also think there are some serious problems, including circumstantially. Of course, the defense don't agree with that. Apparently, attorney Drew Nielsen said, according to Lauren Schaaf, quote, that she doesn't think that the state have met the burden of proof, end quote. And she was asking that Barry be let out on bail, that he not sit in jail. And then the judge said he couldn't make that decision today. So even in terms of giving Barry bail wasn't given, which I think may be an indicator of the larger scheme of things. I also think if this wasn't a high-profile case, it would be easy to say, look, there's just not enough evidence here. But because there's a lot of scrutiny, I think the justice system owes it to the public, owes it to itself really, to get clarity, to take this case to trial. And, it's not as if it goes to trial, Barry will necessarily be found guilty. But I think everyone who's followed this case feels that we owe it to Suzanne, who's still missing more than a year later. We still don't know the circumstances, that these circumstances be tested, questioned, thought about, discussed in a court of law. Don't you think it's time for that? If we look at the legal intertextuality, if we take the Scott Peterson case, the evidence against Scott amounted to a single hair found in a yellow pair of needle-nosed pliers in his boat. Most of the rest of the case against Peterson was circumstantial. Much of the feeling that the jury had against Scott Peterson came from the very indirect but quite damning recorded calls between himself and Amber, where he didn't sound very sad about his wife being missing. But none of that was really direct evidence. So what do you guys think? How do you think the defense did with their finish? Did they end with a flourish? I thought they did very well. They certainly confused me by throwing the cat between the pigeons about the DNA matches on the glove box. I'm going to quote now from an article in the Denver Post, quote, "The partial DNA profile developed from the glove box DNA matched with profiles developed in unsolved SA cases in Chicago, Phoenix, and Tempe," CBI agent Joseph Cahill confirmed during questioning by Barry Morphew's defense attorney Iris Ayton. The new information came Tuesday as Barry Morphew's defense attorneys tried to convince a Chaffee County judge that prosecutors do not have enough evidence to prosecute their client for allegedly killing his wife in May 2020. End quote. My response to this evidence from the defense is threefold. One, aren't they fortunate that they have this to offer? I mean, without it, their defense is looking a little wobbly, perhaps a little shaky. Two, this isn't a DNA case. Any case where there's a cover-up and potentially an inside job, DNA isn't going to be the game changer. Suzanne's vehicle doesn't form part of the crime scene here, as far as I can see. The fact that her vehicle comes up at the very end is bewildering, which is perhaps the point. If there were DNA matches on her bicycle or her helmet, that would be a little more compelling. 3. So could there be an innocent explanation for the SA DNA? Of course, it could have been left by a mechanic, and that would be the logical place to check on those partial profiles. In conclusion, the family dynamic sketches a number of very disturbing scenarios that I don't think Barry can easily explain. I think the judge is convinced that that aspect at least has been established. And in this regard, we refer to a tweet from Lauren as follows, quote, "I think it is well established that Suzanne Morphew was not happy in the marriage," Judge Patrick Murphy said, end quote. Now, unfortunately, because we are not really hearing from Suzanne's daughters, you can't really get a clear idea of what the dynamic was. So, the fact that both daughters also seem to be on Barry's side, you're not getting, we need someone to speak on Suzanne's behalf from within the family, and there's no one. And so that creates a difficulty. Do you agree with that? At the time his wife disappeared, there was marital discord, we know that. There were financial problems, we know that. And Barry's erratic and unusual movements during the critical moments surrounding the events are problematic. I do think the prosecution could have emphasized the financial aspect in more detail. But besides that, do I think they did enough? I do. Do I think the judge will rule in the prosecution's favor? In other words, deciding that there will be a trial? Well, that's the question. We'll know the answer on September 17th. that may be D-Day for the unsealing of the much anticipated Morphew arrest affidavit as well. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I will put a link to the article in the Denver Post, really good article about the DNA found in Suzanne Morphew's car. For those interested in the Summer Wells case, I'll be following up this video with another one showing the genealogical map, which was put together by one of the patrons on Patreon. So I'll be sharing that with you guys a little bit later today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.